Hey there, beautiful souls. Take a moment and think about that person who just really gets under your skin. You know who I'm talking about. That coworker whose every comment feels like sandpaper on your soul. That family member whose moral failings you can spot from a mile away. Or that ex who embodied everything wrong with humanity. We all have these people in our lives, don't we? But what if I told you that the qualities that irritate you most in others might actually be parts of yourself you've buried so deep you can't even recognize them anymore? That's exactly what Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychological thinkers, discovered through his work with thousands of patients. Welcome to an exploration of one of Jung's most powerful insights, shadow projection, a psychological mechanism that silently shapes our relationships, fuels our conflicts, and keeps us trapped in cycles of blame and misunderstanding. This isn't just some abstract theory. It's playing out in your life right now, affecting your relationships, your work, and even how you see yourself when you look in the mirror each morning. Imagine growing up in a family where expressing anger was completely forbidden. Anytime you showed the slightest hint of frustration, you were met with punishment or rejection. What happens to that natural human emotion? Does it just disappear? Jung would say absolutely not. Instead, those emotions get pushed into what he called the shadow, the psychological basement, where we store all the parts of ourselves that feel too dangerous, too unacceptable, or too painful to acknowledge. These aren't necessarily bad traits. They're simply aspects of your full humanity that didn't receive approval or validation. Think about your own upbringing for a moment. What emotions or qualities were you taught to suppress? Vulnerability, ambition, sexuality, independence? Your shadow is as unique as your fingerprint, formed by your particular life experiences and cultural conditioning. But here's the thing about the contents of this psychological basement: they don't just sit quietly in the dark. They find sneaky ways to express themselves, often through the psychological mechanism Jung called projection. Have you ever found yourself in a heated argument, absolutely convinced that the other person is being completely unreasonable, only to later realize that maybe, just maybe, you were overreacting a bit? That uncomfortable realization offers a tiny glimpse into the world of shadow projection. Shadow projection happens when we unconsciously attribute our own repressed traits, emotions, and impulses to other people. It's like your psyche has a projector, constantly beaming your disowned parts onto the screens of other people's personalities. Let me make this real for you. Remember Martin from your office, who seems obsessed with status and constantly name drops important connections? You find it absolutely insufferable, right? But ask yourself, have you completely made peace with your own ambitions? Or have you perhaps pushed down some part of yourself that also yearns for recognition and importance? The things that trigger intense emotional reactions in us, whether disgust, rage, or even unusual fascination, are often clues pointing directly to our own shadow material. As Jung famously said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And this isn't just about negative traits. Maybe you're mystified by your friend who effortlessly pursues her creative passions while you've convinced yourself you're just not the artistic type. That admiration mixed with inexplicable resentment, classic shadow projection of your own creative potential that's been denied expression. Shadow projection doesn't just operate on an individual level. It shapes our communities, politics, and even international relations. Think about how often we demonize those with different beliefs or from different cultural backgrounds. We project our collective shadows onto entire groups of people, turning them into convenient repositories for qualities we refuse to see in ourselves. History is littered with tragic examples. During times of social upheaval, societies often project their fears and insecurities onto scapegoated groups. The other becomes a canvas for our disowned darkness. What's really terrifying is how this mechanism can transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary acts of cruelty or indifference. You can see this dynamic playing out in the polarized discourse of social media today. Each side casts the other as morally bankrupt or intellectually deficient, while remaining blind to similar tendencies within their own camp. The person railing against others' intolerance is often unaware of their own rigid thinking. Those condemning others' moral failings conveniently overlook their own ethical compromises. This blindness to our projections creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more we project, the more certain we become of our moral superiority. The more self-righteous we feel, the more license we give ourselves to treat others poorly, all while telling ourselves a story about being on the right side of history. Now let's talk about another Jungian concept that's equally dangerous: psychic inflation. This occurs when a person unconsciously identifies with an archetypal power or image from the collective unconscious, essentially fusing their ego with something much larger and more powerful. You've seen these people before. The manager who sees themselves as the all-knowing father figure, whose wisdom cannot be questioned. The activist who has merged with the savior archetype, convinced they alone understand the path to social salvation. The spiritual teacher who has identified with the wise sage beyond ordinary human limitations and accountability. When someone experiences psychic inflation, they radiate an uncanny certainty. There's a magnetic quality to them that can inspire devotion in others. But there's also something subtly unsettling, a rigidity, an inability to acknowledge mistakes, a conviction that their perspective represents absolute truth rather than one view among many. Think about that friend who discovered a new diet, spiritual practice, or political ideology and suddenly became an evangelical proselytizer who couldn't talk about anything else. Remember how they seemed to grow both more passionate and less approachable? That's a mild version of what Jung was talking about. In its extreme forms, psychic inflation creates cult-like dynamics. The inflated individual becomes increasingly isolated in their grandiosity, while followers project their own disowned power and wisdom onto the leader. Each side of this dysfunctional dance reinforces the other, creating closed systems resistant to outside information or criticism. Many of us respond to our shadow by developing what Jung called a persona, the social mask we present to the world. Your persona is that carefully curated version of yourself designed to win approval and avoid rejection. Think of it as your psychological Instagram feed, showing only your best angles in the most flattering light. Having a persona isn't inherently problematic. We all need ways to navigate social situations appropriately. The danger comes when you become identified with your persona, forgetting it's just one aspect of your complex humanity. When you believe you must always be the competent professional, the perfect parent, the unfailingly positive friend, or the enlightened spiritual seeker, you create an impossible standard that denies your full reality. The greater the gap between your polished persona and your disowned shadow, the more psychological energy it takes to maintain the facade. This is why you sometimes feel exhausted after social interactions where you were on. You're unconsciously expending enormous energy keeping certain parts of yourself hidden. Over time, this division can lead to what Jung called a neurosis, an inner conflict between your conscious attitude and unconscious reality. The more divided you become, the more likely you are to experience depression, anxiety, or those moments where you suddenly snap and act completely out of character. Remember that time you prided yourself on always being calm and rational, then found yourself screaming at a customer service representative over a minor billing error? Or how you built your identity around being non-materialistic, then had an inexplicable urge to buy something ridiculously expensive? Those are your shadow aspects breaking through, demanding recognition in often inconvenient or embarrassing ways. Another crucial concept in depth psychology is what Freud called repetition compulsion, our unconscious tendency to recreate past traumatic situations in an attempt to master them. This phenomenon often works hand in hand with shadow projection, creating destructive patterns that can persist throughout our lives if we remain unconscious of them. Think about your relationship history. Have you noticed similar painful dynamics emerging with different partners? Perhaps you keep finding yourself with emotionally unavailable people, or in situations where you feel controlled or undervalued. These aren't random coincidences or simply bad luck. They reflect your psyche's attempt to resolve unfinished emotional business from your past. The painful irony is that, without consciousness, these repetition compulsions rarely lead to healing. Instead, They re-traumatize us, reinforcing negative beliefs about ourselves and others. The woman who grew up with an alcoholic father may unconsciously select partners with addiction issues, hoping on some level to finally create a different outcome. But without awareness, she's likely to find herself reliving the same painful story. These cycles can extend beyond romantic relationships into friendships, work environments, and even the communities we choose. The man who felt silenced in his family of origin may repeatedly join organizations where his voice goes unheard. The person who experienced early abandonment may unconsciously test relationships by creating situations that trigger rejection. Without the light of consciousness, we remain trapped in these cycles, wondering why the same painful scenarios keep finding us despite our best intentions to create something different. So far, we've painted a pretty grim picture of the unconscious forces shaping our lives. But Jung wasn't just interested in diagnosing these patterns. He was passionate about transformation and healing. And this is where we arrive at the concept of shadow integration, the conscious process of reclaiming and transforming our disowned aspects. Shadow integration isn't about indulging every impulse or acting out repressed emotions destructively. It's about bringing awareness to what's been hidden, developing a relationship with these aspects of yourself, and ultimately transforming their energy into something constructive and life-affirming. The first step is simply acknowledging that you, like every human being, have a shadow. This might sound obvious, but many people maintain elaborate defenses against this basic recognition. They see themselves as purely good, rational, or evolved, while projecting all negativity outward. Real integration begins with the humility to recognize your own complexity and contradictions. From there, pay attention to your emotional triggers. What makes you disproportionately angry, disgusted, or judgmental? What qualities in others do you find yourself fixating on? These intense reactions almost always point toward shadow material. Instead of immediately acting on these feelings, get curious about them. Ask yourself, what might this reaction be showing me about myself? Dreams also offer rich pathways to shadow material. Those dream figures that disturb or frighten you often represent disowned aspects of your psyche, seeking recognition. Writing down your dreams and reflecting on the emotional qualities of these characters can yield powerful insights about what you've pushed into the shadow. As you begin recognizing your projections and shadow aspects, approach them with compassion rather than self-judgment. These parts develop for reasons that made sense in your particular life journey. They represent attempts to protect you from perceived harm, even if they're now causing problems in your adult life. The beauty of shadow work is that it doesn't just free you from unconscious patterns, it actually releases tremendous creative energy that was previously tied up in repression and projection. Those shadow qualities, once integrated, often become sources of vitality, authenticity, and deeper connection with others. When you can acknowledge your own capacity for the full range of human emotions and behaviors, you develop genuine humility. Not the self-deprecating kind, but the grounded recognition of your common humanity. This creates space for genuine compassion for yourself and others, as you recognize we're all struggling with similar psychological dynamics, even if the specific content differs. Shadow integration also develops your capacity for discernment. You become better at distinguishing between genuine ethical concerns and mere projections. Your moral compass becomes more reliable because it's no longer distorted by unconscious material. You can see people and situations more clearly without the overlays of your unexamined psychological material. Perhaps most importantly, shadow work leads to greater authenticity and aliveness. When you're no longer expending massive energy maintaining a false persona or projecting your disowned qualities onto others, you free up psychological resources for creative expression, meaningful relationships, and genuine presence with life as it unfolds. As we wrap up our exploration of these profound Jungian concepts, I want to bring us back to our current moment. We live in a time of intense polarization where shadow projection operates not just in our personal relationships, but on our cultural and political landscape. Understanding these dynamics doesn't magically solve these divisions, but it does offer a more compassionate and nuanced perspective. The next time you find yourself completely convinced of another person's wrongness or moral inferiority, pause, take a breath. Ask yourself what this intense reaction might be showing you about your own disowned qualities. This doesn't mean abandoning your values or ethical commitments. It means approaching them with greater awareness and humility. Shadow integration isn't a destination, but a lifelong practice. As you bring consciousness to one layer of projection, you'll discover deeper layers beneath. This isn't cause for discouragement, but celebration. Each layer integrated brings you closer to wholeness and authentic engagement with life. Remember, Jung didn't see the shadow as something to be eliminated, but as a source of vitality when properly integrated. Those qualities you've pushed away often contain exactly the energy, creativity, or strength you need for your next stage of growth. So I invite you to get curious about your own shadow, to approach your triggers, judgments, and patterns with compassionate inquiry rather than avoidance or shame. The journey won't always be comfortable, but it offers something far more valuable than comfort: the chance to live with greater authenticity, wisdom, and genuine connection to both yourself and others. As Jung himself said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The path to wholeness leads through the shadow, not around it. And on the other side lies not perfection, but something far more precious: the freedom to be fully, authentically human. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, stay curious about your projections, compassionate with your shadows, and committed to bringing more consciousness into our divided world.